Chapter 9, Final Thoughts. In this chapter, I am going to review the story and mention things that I feel would further prove that the government did railroad Frank to prison. First of all, even though Frank got all that credit, our lifestyle didn't change. We both worked and were happy together. We only bought things that we needed. I asked Frank why he didn't tell me that he was drowning in credit card debt. He said he didn't want to worry me, and he thought that he would maybe get a large loan and pay off some of the debt. I think that Frank was playing Russian roulette with those credit cards. It took the government over 8 years to indict Frank. During this time, nothing changed. If Frank would have gotten rid of all the files he kept, the government wouldn't have had enough evidence to frame Frank. I think I proved that Frank didn't devise a scheme to defraud anybody. Before the United States Postal Service knocked in the doors on our home, the government was determined to get a conviction on Frank, to take the heat off their department because of the primetime TV show on True Name Fraud, which aired the night before the break-in. This show caught this guy they called Ponzi in the act by following him around our city with their hidden cameras. The United States Postal Service couldn't catch Ponzi, but the TV show did. The United States Postal Service targeted Frank for True Name Fraud because of the prime-time live TV show on Ponzi. After the United States Postal Service went over the evidence that they had seized from our home, they realized that Frank did not commit true name fraud and changed the charge to credit card fraud. According to the affidavit of the search warrant, no items in our names were supposed to be seized. However, the United States Postal Service seized these items anyway. The United States Postal Service violated our Fourth Amendment rights by intimidating me by putting a loaded gun to my head while I was sleeping, and by handcuffing Frank with his hands behind him instead of in front of him. It wasn't the false information that Frank put on the credit card applications that got him into trouble. It was the true information. This one bank noticed that all the accounts had the same phone number, street address, and Frank had his name as an authorized user. This bank contacted the United States Postal Service to investigate. I feel that if Frank would have destroyed all the files that he kept, the government wouldn't have enough evidence to convict him. One more thing here before I move on to something else. When the judge sentenced Frank to pay full restitution, she told him that he used other people's money to supplement his income. The problem here is that this restitution order listed about 1/3 of the accounts in our names, and the rest were in other people's names. You may be wondering, how can I recall the details that I mentioned in this story? When this ordeal started over 20 years ago, Frank told me that he was going to write down everything as it happened, and he told me to do the same and keep this information in a box in case we would need to prove something later on. This box was loaded with all the writs, appeals, motions, and lawsuits, and anything pertinent to Frank's case. So now you know how accurate this story really is. I mentioned Mr. Johnson here because he was Frank's Huckleberry friend, and Frank even called him Huckleberry. This Mr. Johnson undermined Frank. I called him the electronic criminal. Remember, what this guy did 20 years ago was groundbreaking, because at that time, I am writing the story, what this guy did, now it would be a cybercrime. This Mr. Johnson was more of a bank robber than Frank was. The law reads, whoever takes and carries away with intent to steal or purloin any property or money or any other thing of value exceeding $1,000 belonging to or in the care, custody, control, management, or possession of any bank, credit union, or any savings and loan association shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 10 years or both. The following was the video store's interpretation of this law as it applies to Mr. Johnson's embezzlement scheme. Mr. Johnson took and carried away with the intent to steal money exceeding $1,000 belonging to the bank of the credit card holder, whose number and expiration date that Mr. Johnson used to electronically transfer funds to his Mac Visa account, and he should be fined or imprisoned not more than 10 years or both. The video store applied this law to Mr. Johnson's crime, the same way the government did to Frank in his crime. The video store is going to demonstrate why Mr. Johnson was more of a bank robber than Frank. Mr. Johnson walked into his bank and he withdrew $10,000 cash, which he had electronically deposited there. Mr. Johnson walked out carrying over $1,000. He broke the bank robbery law. Not only did Mr. Johnson do this once, he on several occasions withdrew other amounts over $1,000. Remember, when a bank robber goes into a bank to rob it, this person may show a demand note to a teller and not even be armed, but the authorities still class this bank robbery as a crime of violence. How many bank robbers get $10,000 cash and get away with it scot-free like Mr. Johnson did? The video store has never been robbed at gunpoint in its 10 years of operation. Mr. Johnson robbed the video store without using a weapon or violence, even though the video store may not be an expert in criminal law, but the video store was an expert when it comes to the investigation that they did on Mr. Johnson's embezzlement scheme of 1997. What I have stated here is a sample of a book that I am working on called The Electronic Criminal, which will be released to the public soon. All the stories I have written are connected. They can be read individually or as a trilogy. I chose to write Railroad to Prison now because it shows over 20 years of a relationship before Frank got into trouble and 20 years after the government used violence and false information to get a conviction on Frank. I think this story would be a great study aid for law students to see how the judicial system can be used to twist the law any way it can to get the result they want. I don't think even if Frank would have had Perry Mason for his lawyer that he would have gotten off scot-free. Believe it or not, Frank is glad that the government is taking 15% of his Social Security towards the restitution that he owes. This is better than trying to pay all those credit cards that he had. This government offset didn't kick in until Frank retired. So if I would have had written this story sooner, it wouldn't have showed how the government works, even using the law to take money from your Social Security. I have a confession to make here. When Frank was sentenced, I was in the courtroom with his best friend. We both wore disguises, and Frank didn't even know we were there. I almost got up and yelled out when the judge said that I was just as bad as Frank because we shared the stuff that Frank got with other people's money. And she said that I could get someone else to take Frank's place. I kept my cool. We left before Frank, and when Frank came home, he told me what the judge said, and I said that I know, and Frank asked me, "How do you know?" I told him I was there with his best friend. Frank said, "I didn't see you there." We both wore disguises. Frank then asked me, "Whose identities did you steal?" "Marie, you better be careful. They might do a news story on you like Action News did on me." I told Frank, "Your case should have been thrown out. the way that judge slandered me. Remember, this was before Frank started serving his sentence at the prison camp. No matter what happens from now on, I am so glad that Frank picked me as the girl of his dreams over 40 years ago. And I wouldn't have wanted to live my life with anyone on planet Earth but Frank. He is the guy of my dreams. I really hated to see Frank go through what he did because of getting involved with the government. I asked him about this, and he said, "Remember, Marie, in every life a little rain must fall." The following is the final thought of this chapter. Now that you heard our side of the story, you can judge for yourself. Was Frank railroaded to prison or not?